It's Start a Great Thursday. I'm Jocelyn Matthews. I'm the community manager at Storage Labs, and I'm here today with Joseph Jacks, who is the founder of OSS Capital and Open Core Summit. I want to say thank you for being here today. It's really exciting to have you here. We were thrilled to be involved with your event last year, and we're back again this year. So I'd like to start off by talking a little bit to frame the discussion about Open Core Summit itself.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Jocelyn. It's always good to chat with you and be supportive of everything you're building too. So it's really great to be here. Open Core Summit's a new conference, and it was started a year ago, focused on what we call the commercial open source ecosystem. So a lot of people in the technology world, even in the world at large, are familiar with at least abstractly, like open source. What it means, is another question. But in the business world, the technology world, there's actually, interestingly, like a new kind of company emerging. And it's specifically a company that builds its business, builds its platform and its organization on an open source core. So essentially what that means is companies that are based on an open source technology at the core, typically one core technology, maybe a handful of projects, but the essence and the way these, what we call them, commercial open source companies create value is derived and driven by the open source technology at the core of the company. So with a bunch of examples we could give you would be like Red Hat is a commercial open source company because without Linux, Red Hat would not exist. And Linux is not owned or controlled or produced by Red Hat. It's produced by thousands of people around the world, employed at many companies, and it creates Linux creates value for many companies. Many companies capture value around Linux, not just Red Hat. The same is true for companies like Cloudera. They would not exist without Hadoop. Companies like GitHub and GitLab would not exist without Git. Companies like Elastic would not exist without Elasticsearch. Companies like Automatic would not exist without WordPress. So it's a very abstract kind of company definition where companies that are fundamentally building their organization, their business on an open source project or open source core are what we think are fundamentally different. They're different types of companies. And so we started this conference, Open Core Summit, really to kind of highlight and emphasize that commercial open source companies are quite unique, exciting, different, and really to unpack those differences and explain the how and the why they're actually different, specifically on many dimensions. Sort of how do those companies generate revenue? How do they go to market? How do they hire people? What are their cultures like? Are the cultures different? What do the business models actually look like? How do you think about going to market and selling your technology and your product as a commercial open source company? And many other things. So we invite really amazing founders, business leaders, investors, and also enterprises on the consumption side, on the buy side of open source and commercial open source, to sort of share contrasting points of view. Our really main principle there is respectful disagreement. There's quite a lot of differences of opinion in this ecosystem. And yeah, we're really excited to grow it this year as a digital event.
Thanks. I just also wanted to comment that all of those different ways that you're approaching the topic and unpacking it seem to feed into the number of tracks that you have. Can you expand a little bit on the tracks that you've got going this year?
Absolutely, yeah. So the tracks last year were a little bit more kind of loosely structured and like lots of different topics along. I think we had 6 or 7 tracks last year. This year we have 10 tracks, and each track is scoped on a different topic, sort of like a different dimension. So people can join a track focused on product development and product engineering. And then we have another track on marketing, go-to-market dynamics, another track focused on culture and hiring. So sort of how do you scale globally, internationally? What does the remote work dynamic look like? Many commercial open source companies are geo-distributed and fully remote from the beginning. And this is actually becoming more of a macro sort of phenomena, even in just companies in general and technology companies, as like remote work is really a front and center topic and huge conversation in the era of the pandemic we're going through. A lot of other topics focused on business model evolution and licensing. We have another track, I believe, focused on engineering leadership. What's interesting about engineering leadership is commercial open source companies kind of have two streams of engineering. There's the open source core, which has its own motions and its own sort of set of priorities and dynamics. And then there's the product engineering side of things. And oftentimes those teams are sort of intermingled. The engineering resources are sort of intermingled, but in some cases, they're actually entirely separate. Obviously, they talk to each other and they're aware of sort of respective priorities and work ethics and stuff, but the engineering dynamics are actually quite nuanced. So we have a whole track dedicated to that. So we try to scope the tracks in terms of functional areas, sort of how do commercial open source companies get built? How do they scale the business building side of things along really all the functional dimensions of company building. So go-to-market, engineering, hiring, business models, and so on.
Thanks. I want to, at some time in this conversation, I also want to come back to the way that the event kind of brings together different generations of founders and builders, because I think that's a really interesting aspect of the event as well. But let's move on to some of the other questions. So William Gibson was quoted once in The Economist as saying, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." What does that mean to you?
Oh, this is a really amazing quote. Yeah, I mean, William Gibson so concisely and articulated something that I think is really just fundamental about knowledge, which is, going back to, whether it was Greek philosophers or Galileo or Isaac Newton discovering theory of gravity and all these amazing discoveries. What I think is most true about that quote is people in sort of small pockets of the world or just on an individual level discover and understand and learn things that really everyone else has yet to figure out or has yet to understand or yet to learn. And in the context of everything that I'm doing, I tend to think that this quote is a really great way of just describing why this commercial open source category is really here. Just the knowledge of it is very unevenly distributed. Is sort of not really understood or known or appreciated by the world, and that's kind of the main thing that's motivating what we're doing with the conference and fund and a few other things around this commercial open source sort of category, which is a lot of people look at commercial open source companies and sort of what they really represent and how they structurally work. And they kind of conflate them with what is already understood. So sort of whether it's a SaaS company or just like traditional, proprietary software company approach. And what I think is very true is that those companies are actually quite different. They just haven't really been recognized and appreciated as being very different. And then further, it's sort of like, once you sort of like kind of buy into the fact that these companies are very different, you start to unpack the how and sort of peel the onion. And so that's kind of like one way of pointing to, the future's here. It's just kind of trapped in the minds of like 50 or so people who've built some large successful commercial open source companies from zero to now over the last decade. And the purpose of this conference is really just to accelerate knowledge distribution outside of the 50 odd brains of founders of companies like Mongo, Elastic, GitLab, Confluent, even Red Hat. This year we're hugely honored actually to have the founder of Red Hat speak, which has not yet been publicly announced, but I'm sure by the time this podcast is out it will be. And really just accelerate the knowledge that those people have accrued and distribute it out to everyone else, so everyone else can have that knowledge too.
I love that point about knowledge distribution. So why is it important for founders and builders to share their knowledge with the next generation? And is that relationship symmetric or asymmetric? So for each side of the equation, why does it benefit them?
That's a really, really great question. I think the primary purpose of sharing knowledge is so that others don't repeat the same costly process of learning or make the same mistakes. I think fundamentally that's the primary purpose of knowledge, is to really amplify the productivity of humanity by learning from each other, and our happiness overall. I think, you know, the ultimate goal of humanity is to be productive, happy, and you know, support each other and so on. So I think it's definitely symbiotic. Like the current generation of founders going out, starting companies, learning about things from zero, definitely benefit hugely from just, you know, quantum leaps of time savings, and just like looking at how previous founders went about fundraising, or went about their first set of hires, or thought about product development iterations, or market dynamics, you know, product differentiation, go to market and sales, like all these things that you have to really figure out to build a successful company. And I think, you know, conversely, the sort of successful, or quote unquote proven founders that built large companies of the last 10 years, what they can learn from both sharing their learnings and just talking to and interacting with and meeting with the current generation of founders, is really they can just kind of stress test their ideas and their learnings, and sort of compare and contrast them with the current directional evolution of the world. Like the founders of today may not have all of the oodles of, you know, scars and war experiences, peacetime, wartime, whatever it happens to be, that proven founders have. But what they do have is a very fresh and untainted, unbiased view of the future, and how they can actually go about making something new and building something new. And I think it's kind of really almost a hard requirement for breakthrough founding of any kind, to have a kind of a clean slate perspective, and to think, you know, from sort of first principles. So I definitely think it helps both sides hugely.
Thanks. One thing that I noticed when we first became involved with this event was how many people know you. You seem like you know a lot of people, and you get around, and you've got a lot of stuff going on. What's it like to grow a conference to the point of being a major player while also having other irons in the fire? Is that a strength?
I don't know if it's a strength. I'm just kind of a crazy person. Like I just like talk to lots of people, and I like learning a lot, and I'm deeply curious. The idea for the conference is actually not mine. I have to give credit to where credit is due. It's actually a good friend of mine, Marco Palladino of Kong, which is a really great commercial open source company, building really a platform around the Kong open source API gateway. And so, you know, Marco's a friend, and one of the great founders in this area. And so it occurred to me that we just needed to do it. I kind of sat on the idea that Marco gave me, like, for a year. I was just like too busy, and I didn't have time to like pick it up. Very, very luckily, I've been just incredibly fortunate to meet thousands of people in the open source kind of world, kind of the open source insiders, if you will, mostly due to having been involved in the Kubernetes project really early, and kind of educating people about Kubernetes. I started a little company. It was like the first Kubernetes startup when Kubernetes was kind of getting going. And then what I also was lucky enough to do was get the conference around Kubernetes started, which is now one of the biggest tech conferences out there. And so it's the KubeCon event. And through that, I mean, that was like really the first conference I started, and you know, Open Core Summit is the second one. So I'm not like an expert conference founder person, but I've learned a lot just like organically. And I think one of the outputs of starting a conference that has the luck of getting large and successful is that you just meet a huge amount of people. And the kind of intersectional, like cross-pollination of people from the open source community with cloud native and Kubernetes is like very, very, like, those concentric circles are very overlappy. And so, yeah, I mean, I just kind of continued to, you know, kind of stay in touch with people. I tweet a fair bit, I guess, and just kind of blogging and that sort of thing. And yeah, just gotten really lucky, staying in touch with people. But doing a conference is no small feat. It's a pretty intense exercise. The only thing I'd say that I have on my side that's a big benefit is really just like the focus aspect, being hyper focused on one very specific thing that you can point to and describe cleanly, that other people aren't really kind of hyper clear about or focusing on very clearly, I think is a really great lever for getting anything done, of potential scale. So I'm lucky in that regard.
Mm. This year, OCS is 15% underrepresented people. Why is that, and what does it entail to make that actually happen?
That's a really great question. So last year we had really horrible representation on the schedule. And we have just unfortunate systemic realities in the tech industry of incredibly underrepresented, minorities, Black, women, people of color in tech leadership positions, on stage at conferences. And so last year, just to kind of unpack the really bad representation, I think it was like 91, it was more than 90%, white men dominated, both on the breakout day and the keynote day. This year, our goal is to have at least 20% of the breakout day be diverse, and on the keynote day, the majority of speakers, diverse speakers. So essentially, my definition of diverse person is a non-white male. You can go a lot further and say, you could be a lot more precise with that. But that's the main thing that I could just find to turn the lever and be very intentional about it. It's just to like minimize the number of white male speakers. So this year we were a lot more intentional with that, and it was something that I kind of explicitly said just directly after the conference last year. And I just think it's as simple as that. Like, there's really amazing, diverse people in the technology industry. You just have to be intentional and go about constructing a program that satisfies that requirement. So it's something we're gonna work on and improve as much as we can over time. But yeah, in general, it's definitely a big problem in the industry.
I'm curious, what was the pipeline for that? Because you hear people talk about the pipeline problem. Is that something that you encountered?
I'm not sure. For us, it's related to pipeline. Mostly, the reason I say that is we didn't have a CFP for the conference last year. It was like all hand selected speakers, or just like sort of thinking of like famous people and like the most high profile people we could find. This year, we also did not have a CFP, which is call for proposals, call for participation. It's basically a process where you open up a form or a way that anyone in the world could like submit a talk. So this year we're still really like selective about who's speaking at the conference, and basically curating the schedule from scratch by hand. I think what allows us to be more basically more precise about controlling this diversity challenge is we can just be like really explicitly selective about who we let speak at the conference. If we had a full-blown submission process, I think we would be maybe a little bit more subject to the pipeline dynamics that maybe a little bit more systemic. But yeah, I mean, this year we're still curating the schedule. I expect next year is going to be interesting because we're going to open up the CFP for 2021. We're going to see how that goes.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So it sounds like the people are out there if you're intentional about finding them.
That's my belief.
You just have to be focused. Oh,
Absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's really, really incredible leaders out there, people who have a lot of wisdom, a lot of insight, both leaders and team members and individual contributors across the board. You really just have to go and find them and put them on a platform to share their learnings. What I think yields kind of very suboptimal results here is really just blanketly saying, oh, we just want the highest of the profile people, the most famous people, and people kind of that are the fancy names of the name brand companies, whatever. And I think with that approach, you're just going to end up with a super
You got the status quo.
Yeah, super imbalanced makeup.
All right. Well, another question I had for you is also related to the event. And since we are Storage Labs, um, what kind of storage needs do you find that events have at different sizes? And following on to that, what would people be surprised to hear about the logistics side of researching those kinds of solutions?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think storage in general is like a fundamental requirement for applications that run on the internet and for computing and software. So what we tend to default to as consumers, I think, and even businesses is just like, what are the big monopolistic platforms offering us, whether it's Google Drive or Dropbox or, or YouTube for video. And I think it's also possible to be more intentional and very innovative about sort of why you're making those decisions and how those decisions impact what gets served to a consumer and how people consume things. So for us, we're generating in this second conference, the second year, potentially close to 75 hours of new content that did not exist before. And so that's pretty cool. The question is, how does that content actually persist and live on the internet? For the default state of things, I think just moving quickly and needing to execute our sort of stack for organizing the entire event is just a collection of frankly, like a dozen different applications and tools, whether it's Google Docs, G Suite, Typeform, Google Form, Mailchimp for all the marketing messaging campaigns, CRM tools, Stripe for payments infrastructure, which is sort of the payment system of record. We've got Invoice2Go for invoicing. We've got a bunch of sort of file editing, video production things, and then for the conference itself, which is being produced on another system of record and application, we actually decided to use Hopin, which is a new SaaS application, and Hopin kind of vertically integrates what you could think of as like Zoom meets Slack meets like Discord meets like you could think of Zoom. Zoom is great for the webinar kind of one-on-one, maybe small team meeting experience, but it doesn't provide like a fully immersive platform that brings you close to an event. What Hopin also integrates is lead collection for sponsors, digital expo booth functionality, lots of those things. Having said that, we're still having to sort of integrate and extend Hopin for a lot of things that we're using other applications for. So what I hope will happen in the future is something like Hopin or Hopin itself can grow and evolve into being a platform for end-to-end event production across every one of the steps that an organizer needs to go through. I've actually written a paper in a spreadsheet that describes all the pain of organizing conferences, and small and large. Like you could organize a 200-person conference, you could organize a 20,000-person conference. I think a lot of the needs are similar. Just depends on sort of the scaling requirements. And the sad reality today is conference producers have to switch between 20 different tools just to produce an event. I think that's pretty nutty. A lot of that actually also boils down to storage requirements.
Yeah, I handle the selection and sponsorships of events at Storage. And so I see different platforms, and there's just a tremendous amount of different tools that people are cobbling together to just try and get things done. Because, the kind of things that you're talking about, I have heard uniformly good things about Hopin from basically everybody that I've talked to about Hopin says really good things about it. So I'm excited that you're using. We talked about how you meet a lot of folks in your line of work. And I guess that means you probably also talk a lot about your respective businesses. How are some of the ways that decentralization's benefits are changing the ways that people carry out business today?
That is such a deep question, and one thing I guess is to sort of unpack what decentralization really means on a bunch of different levels. And what I always actually refer to is the Vitalik Buterin blog post from February 6, 2017, which he published on Medium, and he actually digs into sort of three different ways in which in which things can be decentralized. So you could sort of have logically centralized systems that are politically or architecturally centralized or decentralized. And then you could have logically decentralized systems that have politically decentralized, centralized, or architecturally centralized or decentralized dimensions. And this is a really fascinating post because it gets into spectrums thinking, which is kind of like everything, sufficiently complicated and nuanced has like a gradient, like a grayscale. It's not just a black and white, like binary conversation. And I think Vitalik's post is really great. Maybe you can add it in the footnotes and people can go and read it. It's a really tremendous read. But my views on how decentralization is kind of changing business and how people work are really that I think everyone is already kind of living in a decentralized reality, mostly because of the way the internet works and how, like the internet's kind of changed our fundamental connectedness, human psychology, the way we're influenced by all the data that we consume, the data we produce. And I think it's a really critical thing as well in open source. Open source is kind of fundamentally decentralized in terms of the sort of development, the collaboration model, as well as the consumption model of it. So I definitely think a lot about decentralization.
Who are some of the people to watch in open core and decentralization?
I think some of the more interesting kind of topics and conversations are happening in the protocol development world. So people building new decentralized protocols or consensus algorithms. Let's see. I'm a big fan of David Mazieris's Stellar protocol, which is really a consensus algorithm, first and foremost. And I know Stellar has a sort of payment network and a token and so on, but it's really just kind of computer science work. So I'm a fan of people like that. He's not a very like talkative public person. There's like kind of research papers that are out there, but really incredible computer scientist. I think in the world of kind of open source and open core meets decentralization, there's increasingly a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and kind of learning from those two communities. So people in the investing world and also founders that I know quite well that are really huge proponents of sort of like blockchain cryptocurrency worldview and approach are folks like Balaji Srinivasan, folks like Hasib Qureshi, and there's also the let me see, I'm trying to remember the name of the founder of this fund. Maybe you can edit this part out, but he's actually, so what I would say is there's actually a handful of blockchain cryptocurrency kind of focused technology people speaking at Open Core Summit, and we're actually putting together a panel to sort of talk about the learnings and comparing and contrasting how the sort of decentralized ecosystem world kind of compares and contrasts to this open source ecosystem, which precedes the crypto decentralized world by a couple of decades. So if you look at when Bitcoin was created as sort of the milestone point in time for the sort of blockchain cryptocurrency movement, so sort of 10 years ago, 2009, 2010, open source traces its roots back to the early 80s with the work that Richard Stallman started, GNU, free software, and so on. So open source is really fundamental, and I think the properties of decentralization were sort of core to how open source was really started and kind of how it's evolved as well in tandem with the rise of the internet. What I think we've seen a lot more sharply with cryptocurrency and blockchain as a community ecosystem forming 10 years ago has been kind of a fragmentation of the ideologies and the philosophies in a lot of different ways, which is definitely interesting. And there's a lot of things to learn from that, but many contrasting points of view.
Great, thanks. With the current volatility in markets, gold has been the historical alternative, but now there's assets like Bitcoin, which we just spoke of a minute ago. What do you think of digital assets as a store of value?
I think digital assets is a very broad and fascinating category framing that could potentially include technologies that maybe share very little resemblance to Bitcoin. So I guess what I mean by that is what most people immediately think of is something like Bitcoin or Ethereum when they think of a digital asset, because asset sort of in the finance world refers to, you know, something that has a monetary currency like value.
Sure.
What I feel is a little bit missed from the conversation of how do digital assets play out as a store of value is really the sort of like I guess like the defensibility of an argument that kind of backs up why a lot of people increasingly, so one example being Michael Saylor of MicroStrategy, are actually investing in Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies just sort of purely as a store of value hedge against the dollar, which is the dominant currency in the world, as a consequence of believing that the dollar is losing its currency strength due to basically the yield curve fundamentals, which is to say, the interest rate wall that we've hit, and the sort of continuous printing of money at the rate that appears like there's no end in sight, just enormous waves of printing of money. And I'm not really sure I have an opinion on that argument. I'm not sure I have a strong enough grounding on the facts to say that digital assets, say in our current understanding of them as Bitcoin and Ethereum, kind of more centrally, and derivatives, are a stable and an exciting store of value. I think at a fundamental level they are a store of value because people are storing their money there. The question is, can they be a reliable and trusted store of value over a long period of time? I don't know what the answer is.
Fair enough. So while cryptocurrency was the initial use case for decentralized apps, what do you see as the most interesting of the emerging use cases?
I definitely
this might go back to DeFi again.
Sure. Yeah. And so I guess, I mean, I'm dangerously smart enough to know the DeFi term, decentralized finance. I think storage is definitely way up there on the use cases list. So like how people can actually store bits of information, files, raw encodings of data, data in motion, data at rest, in a system that is essentially like self-replicating with durability, reliability guarantees, greater than a centralized provider like, for example, Amazon could provide. I think that's extremely compelling. And going back to the origins of peer-to-peer computing, 60s and 70s, but really like a bunch of the fundamental algorithms like Kademlia in the very early 2000s, 2001, 2002, those have served as like critical mathematical structures. Things like Kazaa and eDonkey and even Ethereum's network stack are built on. I guess the question is, do we need a cryptocurrency grafted onto that in order to really unlock decentralization on the internet? I'm really not sure. So one of the questions I ask a lot is, how do you actually distinguish between a cryptocurrency and its value in terms of technology applications and open source plus Git? And I haven't been able to get a convincing enough answer on that. So I guess what I mean is, Git solves for the version control kind of fundamentals. You have to write quite a bit of software on top of that, maybe to achieve things like state management and like a database. But and then open source solves for this kind of decentralized dynamic. What I don't think is fully understood is how important a cryptocurrency and a token as being tightly coupled to that really is. I don't think those two things really need to be tightly coupled. So I guess said differently, one of the things I'm probably most convinced of about decentralized apps is that they will happen, and we're going to see a big wave there. I'm just not sure it's going to be in the context of a token and a cryptocurrency. Just my own personal opinion.
I actually agree with you, and I think that sort of crypto is like, it's clear and obvious what why it's a good use case, but I don't I don't know that that's going to be like the next wave, because I think to get to the ubiquitous state, things kind of have to be ubiquitous and not
Yep.
just
Yep.
in one little area.
Yep.
So I think you're onto something there. Before I ask the next question, I have an embarrassing question, which is this COSS or is it COSS? And I'm not sure if I.
whatever you want to say. Honestly, I think
Don't lie to me. You know these people are snobs. Don't lie to me, JJ. What do I
well,
say?
I mean, I think what's cool about so I have a lot of respect for people who mispronounce things because it means they read, right? It means they read and they don't hear. They don't hear how someone pronounces, which is the sign of curiosity and that. So it's just like the preeminent thing that I respect. So honestly, however, what I say is COSS. So S like the end of S like Sam. That's like you pronounce
Right.
Sam, I guess, like COSS. Some people, like actually Bruce Perrins, who's one of my board partners at OSS Capital, and he's like an amazing guy. He's like co-founder of the open source definition. Actually, he's the creator of the open source definition and the OSI. He pronounces it cause, like Z like zebra. And so, but it's fine. I do hope it carries more more weight than however people pronounce it. I want more people to like use any acronym or term to like describe these companies in a different way. And so what I chose is this COSS acronym, but you can say it however you like. I mean, I guess what I say is COSS SAM, kind of with the S, sort of a little bit more extended, but yeah,
Okay.
it is what it is. Like FOSS, like people in the free open source kind of camp pronounce FOSS like FOSS, FOSS, like this,
Right.
the S is like Sam
Like
too.
coffee. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Like yeah. Like that mammal, the fossa.
All right. Well, we've seen a lot of motion in the cost space over the past couple of years, and I'm wondering, what have you seen that's been successful in terms of balancing OS contribution and increasing adoption of commercial services? And what do you think will continue to be successful?
That is a huge question. I don't really know what will absolutely continue to be successful, but I have some suspicions. So there's definitely been a lot of conversation around attention and sort of this push and pull dynamic and drawing of the lines between the open source core and the product and IP and so on. It's a really huge topic. I was just reviewing this massive product versus project product management document that Red Hat's putting out, and it's it's very extensive and so I think ultimately at a high level I'll answer the question like this. And so it's like, over time, my belief is that open source kind of quote unquote eats everything, and that's like over long enough of a time frame. That could be many decades. And by eats, I truly mean, the world is commoditizing faster than anyone can really point a finger at. Open source is fundamentally a commoditization phenomena, as well as many other things, but it speeds the rate of commoditization. With that said, what cost companies I think have to be mindful of is to actually embrace this fundamental commoditization driver at the core of their companies, because the open source project is really an accelerant to commoditization. And if you look at kind of capitalism and business in general, it's like you really want to resist and fight commoditization. Instead, you want to really defend and maintain differentiation possible. So one thing that I think is key to be successful, that I think is just a common pattern I've observed in looking at commercial open source companies, and kind of studying them closely, is that what's really important is to embrace that tension, not resist it. Just kind of like, I use the analogy of skiing. When you learn how to ski, you have to lean forward. If you don't lean forward, you're gonna have a bad experience. You're gonna you're definitely gonna get in an accident. You're gonna fall, and so on. So like, it's kind of that counterintuitive dynamic. Like, commercial open source companies really have to embrace something that at the core really sounds like it's counter to their business, like it's just giving everything away. But at the same time, they have to focus on, instead of building proprietary product, what they really have to focus on is building trust and building a huge level of credibility and trust with all of their stakeholders, not just their customers, but with all of their stakeholders. I'm really encouraged by the way and where the world is headed here, because we're seeing so much more conversation around stakeholder capitalism as opposed to, or in contrast to, shareholder capitalism, which is obsessed with, profits and customers. And what commercial companies, I think, all have in common is that they really embrace this journey to kind of harmoniously balance all the needs of their stakeholders and not just their customers and their profit centers.
Thank you. Okay, last question. Signal is open source. WhatsApp uses the OS library for the signal, and Telegram uses its own proprietary, not open source. Do you have any opinions on the three different approaches to privacy? Oh, it's a big question. Sorry.
That is a big question. No, that's a super interesting question. I'm actually not familiar enough with WhatsApp's usage of Signal's code or like Signal's libraries and stuff that, yeah, I mean, I'm not smart enough to make a comment on that. But if they do use like Signal's like encryption algorithms, for example, I mean, that's amazing. I guess the question is rooted in privacy, and so like how does privacy actually manifest as an important concern for consumers? Because you mentioned all these things are consumer messaging apps: Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, WeChat. I think that over time, consumer sensitivity to privacy is going to grow, and as a result of that growth, products are going to have to get built differently. Right. And so I think that like open source at the core is not going to be enough, actually, which sounds a little strange. So just to unpack that, there's kind of and I think that a lot needs to be written about this that hasn't really been unpacked yet. But there's kind of three types of openness. There's technology openness, which you can really solve easily with open source. Just choose to open source your technology. There's execution openness, which is to say, how does that technology actually run? Where is it running? Who's configured it? Who controls the execution of that technology that's getting served to you? Open source itself doesn't really solve that problem. That's more of a transparency and a chain of trust kind of question. Every technology company in the world is very protective of that execution openness dimension. The third dimension is data. When your data is produced, who owns it? Do you own it? How's it licensed? Who has the ability to monetize your data that you produce? So the biggest companies in the world monetize data and our time. So we are the product. Consumers are the product for TikTok and for Facebook and Twitter and Google. They don't sell proprietary offerings. They sell our time and they sell our content. So that's pretty scary. And I guess if we ever reach a world where we can have openness applied to data, I think all those fundamentals have to change. So I guess all those things are related to privacy. Open source technology is only one dimension to that. That's kind of how I think about this.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank you for your time. It's been really great having you here.